Evelyn Waugh's novel, Brideshead Revisited, begins with a conversation between two upper-class students at Oxford University in the 1920s. One of them, a man by the name of Lord Sebastian Flyte, has received a staunch Roman Catholic upbringing. His friend, Charles Ryder, is an avowed atheist. Charles sets out to demolish Sebastian's church and its teaching. "I suppose they try to make you believe an awful lot of nonsense," he said. "Is it nonsense? I wish it were. It sometimes sounds terribly sensible to me. But, my dear Sebastian, you can't seriously believe it all, can't I? I mean about Christmas and the star and the three kings and the ox and the ass." "Oh yes, I believe that," Flyte responded. "It's a lovely idea." "But you can't believe things because they're a lovely idea." "But I do," he replied. "That's how I believe." Notice it's not "that's what I believe," but "that's how I believe." So this morning, I'm inviting you to think for a few moments about how you believe. But first, a word about people who don't believe, at least not in the traditional religious sense of the word. Atheists, the Charles Ryders of the world, may disbelieve in a variety of ways. Some atheists are quite dispassionate about it. They have a kind of a live and let live attitude. They've thought about it calmly and rationally, and they've worked their way through to an intellectual conclusion, namely that God does not exist. Others, though, are quite passionate atheists. Some might say, and have said, fundamentalist atheists. Writers like Richard Dawkins and the late Christopher Hitchens, who I talked about in a sermon 2 weeks ago. Men who seem to be on a mission, determined to convince people of the stupidity and harmfulness of their religion. Now let me put in a good word in support of the atheists in my life. In a sermon I preached 2 weeks ago on atheism, which I know you've committed to your hearts and cherish every single day of your lives, I said that atheists are God's whistleblowers. And I said that because I think that atheists challenge us in a good way, those of us who claim to have faith of some kind. They challenge us to be clear about what we believe and to be able to articulate it and defend it. They remind us to be careful about the kind of language we use and the kinds of assumptions we make, and to check our arrogance at the door. And as I said then, they ask difficult questions that we religious people too often dismiss or ignore. Questions about science ignored by religion, about history conveniently forgotten, about suffering caused by religion. And so at one end of the spectrum, there are atheists of both the passionate and the dispassionate variety. And then there are those who have very personal and very emotional reasons for dismissing the idea of God. Many of you, like me, I can tell by looking at you, are old enough to remember a TV show called Front Page Challenge. And a panelist on that show, a curmudgeonly journalist named Gordon Sinclair. Now the backstory is that Gordon Sinclair had a daughter who died at a very young age. And he gave up any semblance of belief in a God because God had failed to save her. In a sense, people like Gordon Sinclair are trying to have their revenge on God by not believing in God, and yet, in a strange twist, they still need a God at whom to be angry. And then there are people who come out of a religious tradition and who still have a keen sense of that spiritual dimension in their lives, but who no longer consider themselves theists. In other words, they may have a sense of something more, something bigger, something beyond us, something ultimate, but they would not name this reality God. For some people, the very word God carries so much cultural and religious baggage, and so much pain has been caused in the name of God, that for some people it's no longer a useful word. And in fact, Paul Tillich, widely regarded as one of the most influential theologians of the 20th century and no raving radical, once said that we should have a moratorium on the word God for 100 years. Because the way people have used that word has been so hurtful and so damaging to so many people. And just think about it, if we couldn't use the word God, then we'd have to come up with other titles, other names, other ways of describing this experience in our lives. Words like the sacred, the divine, the other, the ultimate. I actually think it would be an extremely interesting and useful experiment. And so what I'm saying is that there are many ways of not believing, of not quite believing, or of almost believing. Many varieties of atheism and agnosticism, some of them hostile to traditional religion, some of them merely indifferent to it, and some of them looking to something beyond traditional religious belief. And maybe some of you would locate yourselves somewhere within that range of skepticism and doubt. But I said that I wanted to invite you to consider how you believe. So assuming for a moment that you are someone who does believe in some way or another, let me count the ways, or at least a few. There are some people, of course, who believe in the same way that Sebastian Flight in that story from Brideshead Revisited believed. Like Sebastian, maybe yours is just a simple, trusting faith. And I don't mean that in a patronizing way. When it comes to the Bible, maybe you accept it all unquestioningly and uncritically. And you may believe this way partly because you trust the authority of Scripture and the Christian tradition. And perhaps, like Sebastian, you're attracted to these stories simply because, as Sebastian says, they are a lovely idea. Some people go through their whole lives believing in this way. But other people, as they go through adolescence and adulthood, find that this sort of faith no longer suits them. One thing that most ministers have learned from experience is to never, ever, ever tell someone sitting beside them on an airplane that you're a minister. And I say that because invariably, when people find out that you're a minister and it's clear that you have no graceful means of escape, They assume that you're just dying to hear their life story. And especially the part of the story that goes like this. And I've heard it so often that it's like a script. Well, I was brought up in the church and I used to believe in God, but as I got older, I just couldn't believe in that old man in the sky with the long white beard. And so I gave up faith entirely. And besides, you can worship God in nature, blah, 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 blah. And I suppose I could tell the truth and say that I don't believe that either. But I fear what might happen if I did. I'd be another of those atheist United Church ministers. So this is why I now carry earphones with me when I fly. And I put them on long before the plane even taxis to the runway, plugged into absolutely nothing. There comes a point in the lives of many of us that we either stop believing in God altogether, or we adapt our belief to something that takes into account our growing awareness of history and science and psychology. Some, for instance, learn more about the Bible and how it came to be written. They learn that there are different ways of interpreting Scripture. Some people interpret Scripture in a literal way, other people, like me, in a metaphorical and contextual way. And when people start to study these matters, when people take an interest in things like this, one of two things tends to happen. Some people feel completely disillusioned and angry and give up their faith altogether. But others may find that what they need is simply a different kind of faith. They may find this new quest really exciting, and they ask why nobody ever told them this stuff before. They may find a kind of faith that welcomes their intellectual curiosity, a faith that values questions even more than answers. And realizing all of this, some people will find themselves still believing, but in a stripped down kind of way. Some will be interested in exploring what really lies behind the stories we read in the Bible. But whether they have this interest or not, they may develop a faith based only on those things that they feel confident are provable and factually true. They will bring what we call a modern or scientific mindset to questions of the spirit. They will find that they can believe only in things that seem rational to them, things that they find intellectually satisfying and convincing. So that's one way of believing. But there's another way of believing. It's perhaps based more on things like intuition and emotion and imagination, rather than on detailed analysis and rational thought. It's a kind of belief that reminds me of the words of the French philosopher Blaise Pascal, who said, "The heart has its reasons that reason knows not of." It's a kind of belief that may find expression not so much in words of science and history, but in works of art and poetry and music. It reminds me of the wise old indigenous storyteller who says, as he begins to tell his tribe's creation story, "Now, I don't know whether it happened this way or not, but I know this story is true." Or the wise old priest who once said, "The Bible is true, and some of it might have happened." And what they meant, of course, is that truth, with a capital T, is not just about verifiable facts. A story may be a complete fabrication, like a fairy tale or a Greek myth, but it still has a truth to tell. And that's how some people read the Bible. And that's how some people believe. When they hear the stories, they may engage in what has been called the willing suspension of disbelief, in order to allow the stories to teach their truth. And that expression I discovered this week actually comes from the English poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge, speaking in 1817, when he said, "That willing suspension of disbelief for the moment, which constitutes poetic faith." In our congregation of Arundel United Church, I'm sure that we have, in answer to the multiple choice question, all of the above. Atheists, agnostics, probably more than we know, doubters, questioners, and people of faith. We have a diversity of belief and theology in the United Church of Canada, but surely we can all agree on one thing, that there is not just one path, that there is not just one right way of believing. The scripture reading this morning that Jean read for us from 1 Corinthians chapter 12 attests to the variety of gifts and approaches in the one body. Specifically, it addresses what it means for a community of faith to function with mutual care and respect for all its different members. God grant us the grace to do just that. Thanks be to God.